The snowstorm came faster than Charlie Norris had expected, biting through the thin fabric of his wool coat. With the wind howling and the temperature dropping fast, he knew the only way he'd survive the night was by using his secret trick to keep his coffee from freezing. Before we saddle up and ride further, let us know where you're tuning in from. If Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. The winter of 1888 came early, sweeping through the Wyoming plains with a vengeance. Charlie Norris, a cowboy who had spent most of his life drifting across the open range, had long learned to respect the unpredictable nature of the land. The storm had arrived out of nowhere, as storms often did in the mountains, and it caught him miles from shelter. His horse's breath puffed invisible clouds, and the snow began to fall in thick, relentless sheets, covering the ground in minutes. It didn't take long for Charlie to realize that this was no ordinary snowstorm. The winds picked up, shrieking across the plains with a ferocity he hadn't seen in years, pushing the snow into drifts so deep they threatened to bury his path entirely. He could feel the temperature dropping, biting through his coat and gloves as he huddled against the side of a low ridge. Snow whirled around him, and the horizon had disappeared entirely into a white haze. As the storm intensified, he knew he had to find shelter before it was too late. Charlie had been caught in storms before, but this one felt different. The wind cut at his skin like a knife, and the snow seemed determined to bury him where he stood. He had a cabin nearby, but it was still miles away. He'd never make it in time, not with the snow falling so fast and thick. His only chance now was to make camp. He moved swiftly, gathering what little firewood he could find. His hands were numb with cold, but he had done this 1,000 times before. He'd learned early that a fire was more than just warmth, it was life. With practiced movements, he cleared a small patch of snow, scraping away the frozen ground beneath, and set up a fire ring using stones he found nearby. Charlie worked quickly, his movements sharp and precise despite the biting cold. The wind howled, but he had the fire going within minutes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. But that wasn't the only thing he needed to worry about. As the fire crackled to life, Charlie pulled out his metal tripod, a tool he'd fashioned for this very reason. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple stand with a hook to hang his tin mugs, but it was crucial. The wind howled louder, and the snow began to pile up around his makeshift shelter. But in that moment, as Charlie carefully hung the mugs of coffee over the fire, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't just about the warmth, it was the trick that kept his coffee from freezing, the trick that had saved him more times than he cared to count. The storm raged outside, but Charlie's coffee would stay warm, and with it, so would he. The storm showed no signs of letting up as the hours stretched on. Charlie sat beside his fire, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames as they fought to keep the night's bitter cold at bay. The wind screamed through the cracks of his makeshift shelter, rattling the stones around his fire ring as if trying to tear it apart. But Charlie didn't mind the noise. He was used to it. The prairie wind, howling and relentless, was as much a part of the wilderness as the coyotes that roamed the night. The fire crackled, sending a comforting warmth into the air, but Charlie knew it wouldn't last forever. He glanced at the tin mugs hanging over the flames, watching the steam rise in delicate tendrils. The coffee was warm, just as it should be. Thanks to his secret trick, he had learned early on that in a storm like this, you couldn't take anything for granted. In the past, he'd watched too many men make the mistake of thinking they were safe, only to find their coffee frozen solid the next morning, their spirits shattered by the cold. It wasn't just about the coffee, though. It was the warmth, the small comforts of survival that kept a man going. And tonight, with the blizzard pushing against the cabin and the snow piling higher by the minute, Charlie needed every comfort he could get. He shifted his position, trying to get more comfortable on the hard ground, but it was useless. The cold was creeping in through the seams of his coat, and the wind seemed determined to find every crack and crevice. He pulled the woolen blanket tighter around his shoulders and leaned closer to the fire, careful not to jostle the mugs. The night was long, too long. The kind of night where you lost track of time, where the only measure of passing hours was the way the storm seemed to grow in intensity. He glanced at the horizon where the first signs of dawn should have been, but there was nothing but a wall of snow and wind. The storm had swallowed everything. The fire burned low, and Charlie added another log to keep the heat up. His hands were stiff from the cold, but the coffee still hung over the flames, untouched. He felt a sense of relief knowing that, no matter how fierce the storm, the trick would keep the mugs warm. It wasn't the fire itself, it was the way the tripod suspended the mugs just right, keeping the coffee from freezing, even when the world outside was nothing more than a blanket of snow and bitter wind. Charlie took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the fire. He didn't need to be in a rush, not tonight. The storm would pass eventually, just as it always did. But tonight, it was more than just the snow. It was a reminder of how quickly things could change, how nature could turn the world into something cold and unforgiving in an instant. With the wind howling outside, Charlie let his mind wander back to the days when he first started riding the plains. Back when the winters were manageable and he had never worried about keeping his coffee warm. He had laughed at the older men who made all kinds of precautions, never thinking that he'd end up relying on them himself. Now, as the snow continued to fall in thick blankets around him, he was grateful for every bit of wisdom they had shared. He shifted again, glancing at the mugs that hung over the fire. He reached for one, feeling the warmth radiate through the tin. A slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through the night. The wind howled louder as the night stretched on, its eerie whistle rising and falling like a mournful song through the cracks of Charlie's shelter. The fire crackled, its dancing flames casting a flickering glow on the stone walls of his makeshift camp. Charlie leaned back against the rocky overhang, his eyes half closed as he felt the warmth seep into his bones. But despite the comfort of the fire, he knew better than to get too comfortable. The storm was a reminder that even the strongest shelters and the warmest fires couldn't guarantee safety in this unforgiving land. Charlie's mind wandered back to the last time he had been in a storm like this. It had been years ago, but the memories felt as fresh as if they had happened yesterday. He had been caught out in a blizzard then, too far from any shelter, with nothing but his horse and the cold to keep him company. But unlike tonight, there had been no secret trick to keep his coffee warm. No tripod, no clever invention to protect him from the cold. That night had ended in near disaster. But not this time. This time, his coffee was safe. The trick worked. The warmth from the fire clung to the mugs, preserving the heat, keeping the cold at bay. With the wind screaming outside and the snow piling higher against his shelter, Charlie felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't about the comfort. Not really. It was about survival. It was about knowing that no matter how bad the storm got, he could depend on his own ingenuity to keep the most important things safe. He reached for one of the mugs and took a long, slow sip. The warmth filled him, and for a moment the howling wind outside faded into the background. He could feel the heat traveling down into his chest, soothing his stiff muscles. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment. It wasn't much, just a cup of coffee, but tonight it felt like everything. Charlie had learned to make do with little, and it was that ability that had kept him alive through winters like this one. He had learned that you couldn't rely on anything out here except your wits and your will to survive. It was the cold that made you strong, made you sharp. It was the quiet of the storm that sharpened your instincts. And it was the tricks, the little things that kept you going when everything else seemed determined to drag you down. As the minutes ticked by, Charlie's thoughts drifted to the years he had spent alone on the plains. It had always been this way, just him, his horse, and the land. The few times he had ventured into town felt like a lifetime ago. Out here, there were no distractions, no comforts. It was just the raw, unforgiving wilderness, and the cowboy who knew how to live with it. He took another sip of coffee, this time lingering on the taste. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. There were men out there who had spent their entire lives on the frontier, men who had built entire lives out here in the wild. But Charlie didn't need to be like them. He didn't need a fancy cabin or a herd of cattle to be a success. All he needed was what he had now: his coffee, his fire, and the quiet knowledge that he was prepared for whatever this storm might throw at him. And with that thought, Charlie leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire and the heat of the coffee keep him grounded in the storm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring: more snow, perhaps, or the quiet calm of the plains after the storm passed. But for tonight, he had what he needed. By midnight, the storm had intensified. The wind screamed across the plains with such force that the snow was no longer falling in flakes, but in a heavy, almost blinding sheet. Charlie could barely make out the shape of his fire, now reduced to a low burn. The fire had been his lifeline, the one thing that had kept him from freezing to death in the past, but tonight he felt the first bite of doubt creeping into his bones. He glanced at the 2 mugs suspended over the flames, their contents still steaming in the icy air. The trick had worked so far, but he wasn't sure how much longer the warmth would hold. The storm raged outside, and the temperature continued to plummet. The wind howled so fiercely that Charlie could hear it whistling through the cracks in his shelter. He adjusted his position beside the fire, trying to get more comfortable. But the cold had a way of sinking deep into a man's bones, no matter how many blankets he wrapped around himself. Charlie's gaze shifted back to the mugs hanging over the fire. His secret trick had worked in the past, but he had never faced a storm quite like this one. The snow piled higher by the minute, and he could feel the cold creeping in from every direction. If he didn't make sure the mug stayed warm, the coffee would freeze before he could finish it, and that would be the first sign that the storm had won. He couldn't afford to let that happen. Charlie reached out and adjusted the tripod, making sure the mugs were still suspended just above the flames. The heat from the fire kept the coffee warm, but the flames had started to die down, and with the storm still raging, he knew he had to do something more to protect it. He fed another log into the fire, watching as the flames sparked back to life. For a moment, the light from the fire illuminated the cabin, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The storm outside was a relentless beast, but inside, Charlie was determined to stay in control. The mugs hung steadily over the flames, their contents now bubbling gently. Charlie let out a breath of relief, watching the steam rise into the air like a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. The coffee was still warm, but he couldn't afford to grow complacent. He checked the fire again, making sure it was burning brightly enough to keep the heat up. The storm outside was relentless, but Charlie's focus remained on the mugs, watching them with a quiet intensity. He'd never been one to rush. He knew that survival wasn't about speed, it was about making sure you had what you needed when it mattered most. And tonight, as the storm howled and the snow continued to fall, the warmth of the fire and the trick that kept his coffee from freezing were the only things that stood between him and the cold. Charlie didn't sleep much that night. The storm was far too fierce, and the wind was relentless. Even with the fire burning steadily and the coffee warm in his mugs, he couldn't escape the feeling that the world outside was trying to swallow him whole. The snow continued to fall in heavy sheets, and he could hear the wind battering against the shelter, rattling the stones and the walls. He kept his eyes on the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, feeding it occasionally with another log. He glanced at the coffee, still warm over the fire, and felt a small sense of satisfaction. The trick was still holding. His secret to keeping the coffee from freezing had worked before, but now, faced with this relentless storm, it felt more important than ever. Every detail mattered, and tonight, the warmth of that coffee was one of the few comforts left in this wild, snow-choked world. Charlie shifted slightly, feeling the cold creeping into his bones. He pulled the woolen blanket tighter around his shoulders and reached for his mug. The warmth from the metal of the tin cup seeped through the thin leather of his gloves, a welcome relief from the biting cold. He took a long, slow sip, savoring the taste, the heat, the simple comfort it brought. But even as he did, he knew that comfort would be fleeting. The storm wasn't going to stop any time soon. The wind shrieked as if to prove him right, sending another wave of snow up against the shelter. Charlie's eyes narrowed as he listened. It wasn't just the wind. The howling seemed to echo, as though the storm was alive, pressing in on him from all sides. The fire crackled, and he threw another log on the flames. He couldn't afford to let it die down, not with the temperature dropping so quickly. He stood and moved closer to the fire, making sure the mugs hung securely, their contents still warm. The coffee was his only real luxury out here. Everything else was a matter of survival. The cold, the isolation, the unrelenting weather, they were just obstacles, things to be overcome, much like the dangers he'd faced in the past. But the storm tonight, it felt different, more dangerous. It wasn't the type of storm that you could outrun or simply wait out. This was a trial, a test of endurance. Charlie adjusted the mugs slightly, ensuring they hung evenly over the fire. He thought about how the other cowboys would have handled this kind of weather. Some would have braved it, their pride too strong to admit any fear. Others would have fled for shelter, abandoning their camp to save themselves. But Charlie wasn't like most cowboys. He wasn't afraid to admit when the storm was too much. He just did what he had to in order to survive. And tonight, that meant keeping his coffee warm and his fire burning, no matter what. As the night dragged on, the wind outside began to lose some of its fury. Charlie sat by the fire, the warmth slowly seeping into his stiff body. The storm had reached its peak hours ago, but its remnants still clung to the air, filling the cabin with an eerie silence that only the crackling of the fire could break. The snow had fallen in such layers that it was hard to believe that it had only been a few hours since the worst of it began. Now, the worst seemed to be over. Charlie hadn't moved much since he'd added the last log to the fire. His body was tired from the cold, and his eyes heavy from the long vigil. But the storm was finally letting up. The wind had settled into a soft, steady howl instead of the violent gusts that had cut through him earlier. It felt like a promise, like the worst of the storm had passed, and what was left was just the cleanup. He glanced again at the mugs hanging over the fire. The trick, his secret trick, had kept his coffee warm through all of it. He'd heard tales of men being stranded in storms like this, men who'd lost their way or hadn't been prepared. Many of them hadn't made it, but not him, not Charlie Norris. He had learned early that survival wasn't about luck, it was about preparation. It was about knowing what to do when the world turned against you. Charlie sat up straighter, stretching his legs out in front of the fire. He could feel the first signs of stiffness in his joints, nothing serious, just the cold creeping into places where he hadn't been able to cover. He rubbed his arms and shoulders, his breath coming out in little clouds as he moved. The cold would have seeped deeper if he hadn't taken such care with the fire, but it was still a battle, and the storm wasn't quite finished with him yet. He stood and went to the door of the shelter, careful not to jostle the mugs hanging over the fire. The cabin was tiny, but it was enough for one man to survive the night, and tonight it had been enough. The snow had drifted up against the door, and the night air felt colder than it had when he first arrived. But the wind was quieter now, and the heavy snow had started to slow. Charlie knew that when the sun came up, he'd be able to head out, maybe make it back to his cabin. But for now, there was only the fire, the coffee, and the feeling that the storm had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. Charlie returned to his spot by the fire, a small flicker of hope rising in his chest. The worst had passed. He'd made it. The storm would pass, just like all the others. By dawn, the storm had finally calmed, leaving behind a quiet blanket of snow that stretched across the plains like a white sea. The wind had settled into a soft murmur, and the harsh bluster that had torn through Charlie's shelter for hours was now a distant memory. He stood at the door of the cabin, staring out into the early light. His breath hung in the cold morning air as he surveyed the land, the fresh snow thick and undisturbed. The silence was unnerving after the chaos of the storm, but Charlie welcomed it. The worst was over. He grabbed his coat, still damp from the hours spent near the fire, and pulled it tight around his shoulders. The fire inside had burned low, but the coffee still hung above the embers, warm and inviting. It was a comfort he didn't take for granted, especially in these unforgiving conditions. He took one last look at his shelter before stepping outside. The cold air hit him like a fist, but Charlie was prepared. His boots crunched through the snow as he made his way toward the ridgeline. The snow had fallen so thickly that it was nearly impossible to see the trail, but he knew the terrain well enough to navigate by instinct. As he climbed higher, the wind began to pick up again, but this time it was manageable. The worst of the blizzard had passed, and now the snow only seemed to hang in the air like dust, light and easy to ignore. He moved steadily, his mind focused on the trail ahead. His cabin was a few miles out, and he was determined to reach it before the temperature dipped any lower. But as Charlie crested the ridge, something caught his eye. A figure, no, several figures were approaching from the distance. At first he thought it might be another traveler, perhaps someone else caught in the storm, but as they drew nearer, he recognized the sled they were pulling. Charlie's heart sank as he realized what it meant. The Johnson family, a small group of settlers living a few miles south of his cabin, were on the sled. The man in front was Peter Johnson, struggling to keep the sled from tipping in the deep snow. His wife lay motionless beneath blankets, and two children huddled close, shivering violently. Charlie knew immediately that the family had been caught in the storm. They had probably run out of firewood and food, unable to make it back to town. Now it was his turn to help them. The sight of their misery twisted in Charlie's gut. He had been prepared for the storm, but they had not. "Charlie!" Peter called out weakly, his voice cracked with exhaustion. Without a word, Charlie rushed forward. "Come on," he said, pulling the sled to a stop. He turned to the family, his eyes scanning the children and their mother. "Get inside. I've got enough firewood to last through the night." Charlie didn't wait for another word. He lifted the blankets off Mrs. Johnson and carried her, despite the weight of the cold creeping into his limbs. His secret trick with the coffee hadn't only saved him, it had just given him the strength to help others when they needed it most. The cabin was a welcome sight as Charlie made his way back down the ridge with the Johnson family in tow. The sky had lightened slightly, but the air still held the bitter chill of the night. As he reached the clearing where his cabin stood, the weight of the storm seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by the steady warmth that awaited inside. The small structure was more than a shelter. It was a symbol of survival in a place where life could slip away as quickly as the cold settled in. Charlie pushed open the door and helped Mrs. Johnson inside, guiding her to the warmth of the fire. Her husband, Peter, staggered in behind him, his thin frame shivering from the cold. The two children followed closely, their eyes wide with exhaustion. It was clear they hadn't eaten much in the past day or two, and their faces were pale from the cold. Charlie didn't waste time with small talk. He knew what needed to be done. He moved quickly to the fire, adding another log and stirring the pot of stew he had set on earlier. The smell of warm food filled the cabin, a reminder of how little it took to comfort a person when everything else was stripped away. As he worked, he glanced back at the family, seeing them settle in by the fire. Peter Johnson sank down onto the floor, his eyes drifting shut in relief. His wife, still weak, had wrapped herself in a blanket and rested against the wall, her children clinging to her. Charlie watched them. For a moment, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference settling into his chest. The storm had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but now, as the warmth from the fire radiated through the cabin, it felt like the world was once again in balance. "Thank you," Peter said hoarsely, his voice cracked with emotion. We didn't know what we were going to do, couldn't make it back to town. I don't know how we'd have survived without you." Charlie gave a nod, offering a quiet smile. "No need for thanks," he replied. "I'm just glad you made it." The fire crackled as they all sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the room pushing away the chill of the night. Charlie felt his own exhaustion catch up with him, but he didn't mind. It was worth it to know the family was safe, that they wouldn't have to face the storm alone. As the minutes passed, Charlie found himself reflecting on the past few days. He had made it through the worst of the storm, kept his coffee warm when it mattered most. And now he had helped others when they needed it most. It was moments like these that made the hardships of the frontier feel worthwhile. He glanced at the family once more, his heart light with a quiet sense of peace. The storm was gone, and with it, the harshest test of his endurance. But Charlie knew, deep down, that there would always be another challenge waiting on the horizon. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered in the heavy silence that now filled the cabin. Charlie sat by the fire, his hands resting on his knees as he watched the Johnson family settle in. They had been quiet since Charlie had brought them inside, too exhausted to say much more than thanks. The fire had warmed them, and the stew had filled their stomachs, but it was the unspoken bond of survival that kept them close. Out here, in the wilderness, you didn't need words to know you had been saved. Charlie could still hear the wind howling outside, but it was no longer the threatening roar it had been during the storm. Now it was just a reminder, a low moan that was almost comforting in its consistency. He had weathered worse storms, he knew that. But this one had come at him with a fierceness that made him realize how fragile life truly was out here. A storm like that could kill you if you weren't careful. And yet, it wasn't the storm itself that had caused him to worry. It was the realization that even with his trick to keep his coffee warm, even with his preparation, he could have been as vulnerable as the Johnsons had been if things had gone wrong. He glanced over at Peter, who had fallen asleep by the fire, his face finally relaxed in the warmth. The children were nestled under a pile of blankets, breathing steadily. Mrs. Johnson was awake, but her eyes were half closed, and her face was pale. Charlie felt a flicker of sympathy for her. He knew what it was like to feel helpless in the face of the land's cruelty. He had survived for so long because he had learned to adapt to think ahead. And tonight, his thinking had kept him alive, and kept others alive, too. The family's gratitude felt heavy in the air, and Charlie didn't know what to say. Words seemed unnecessary. The truth was, out here, you didn't need much more than what you could carry, and tonight he had given them what he could shelter, warmth, and a trick that had kept them all safe. His coffee had been the smallest part of it, but it had been a constant, a little act of preservation that reminded him time and time again that survival wasn't just about making it through the storm. It was about making it through the quiet moments afterward when everything felt uncertain. Charlie reached for his mug of coffee, still warm above the fire. He took a sip, letting the heat fill him, and felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. The trick had worked. It had worked when everything else seemed impossible. The fire burned low as the storm outside continued to wane, leaving behind the promise of another day. But for now, Charlie was content. The land had thrown its worst at him, and he had survived. And in that quiet victory, he felt a lesson well learned. Sometimes the greatest survival trick wasn't about outsmarting nature. It was about knowing when to wait and when to act. The dawn light filtered weakly through the small window of Charlie's cabin, casting pale shadows on the stone walls. The storm had passed, and with it the raw fear that had gnawed at him through the night. Outside, the world was still buried beneath the snow, but the fierce wind had died down, and the sun's reluctant rise hinted at the promise of a clearer day. Charlie stood by the window for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. He had made it through the worst of it, he always did, but this storm had been different. The intensity, the unpredictability, it had pushed him in ways he hadn't expected. He turned away from the window and moved toward the fire, which still burned low, casting warm glows across the cabin. The mugs hung where they had been all night, still above the embers, a small but reassuring presence. His coffee trick had done its job, keeping the cold at bay and offering him a much-needed sense of continuity in a world that had been whipped up in chaos. As he reached for one of the mugs, Charlie paused. He had made it through the storm, but more importantly, he had done so by relying on his preparation, on the small things that mattered when everything else seemed to be slipping away. The Johnsons were still asleep by the fire. Peter's snores were soft, steady, while the children rested close to their mother. Mrs. Johnson's face had color in it now though she was still pale. It had been a rough night for them, but they were safe. The storm had thrown its worst at them, and Charlie had done what he could to help them survive it. He poured the last of his coffee into his mug, staring into the dark liquid for a moment. The coffee wasn't just warmth in a cup, it was a reminder. A reminder that survival wasn't about conquering nature, it was about enduring it. You didn't defeat the land, you learned how to live with it. And sometimes that meant knowing when to push forward and when to sit back and let time pass. Charlie stepped back and watched the fire, letting the warmth seep through his bones. There was still much to do. He would need to gather more firewood, check on the traps he had set earlier in the week, and, eventually, make his way to town to resupply. But for now, he felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that only comes after a long, cold night when you know you've done what was needed. The Johnsons would make it back to their cabin once the snow settled, and Charlie would return to his quiet life. The storm had come and gone, but Charlie had endured it. That was enough for today.